On December 13, 1937, Japanese soldiers entered the Chinese capital of Nanjing after weeks of brutal fighting. What happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. For 6 weeks, the streets ran red with blood. Japanese troops went door to door, dragging out men, women, and children. They lined them up and shot them. They beheaded them for sport. They threw babies into the air and caught them on bayonets. They raped women in front of their families and then killed them. They burned entire neighborhoods to the ground. By the time the massacre ended in late January 1938, over 300,000 people were dead. The Yangtze River was choked with corpses. The city was in ruins, and the world did nothing. 2 Japanese officers even held a public competition to see who could kill 100 people first with a sword, and newspapers celebrated them as heroes. This was not war. It was systematic extermination. If this story makes your blood run cold, if it makes you question how humanity can sink this low, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Share this with others so the victims are never forgotten. Because what happened in Nanjing was not just a massacre, it was a crime against humanity that the world tried to forget. Now let me take you back to 1937, to the final days before Nanjing fell, and show you how an entire city became a graveyard.
To understand the Nanjing massacre, we must first understand the context. On July 7, 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War officially began after a clash between Chinese and Japanese troops near Beijing. Japan had been expanding its control over China since 1931, when it invaded Manchuria, but this marked the beginning of full-scale war. The Japanese Imperial Army was one of the most disciplined and technologically advanced military forces in Asia. They believed in the superiority of the Japanese race and viewed the Chinese as inferior people who deserved to be conquered and subjugated. This ideology, combined with brutal military training that emphasized absolute obedience and dehumanization of the enemy, created soldiers capable of unimaginable cruelty. By early November 1937, Japanese forces had captured Shanghai after 3 months of intense fighting. The battle cost both sides heavy casualties, and Japanese soldiers were exhausted, frustrated, and filled with rage. Their commanders gave them a simple order: march to Nanjing, capture the Chinese capital, and crush all resistance. As the Japanese army advanced westward along the Yangtze River toward Nanjing, they left a trail of destruction. Villages were burned, civilians were massacred, and women were raped. This was not accidental violence. It was a deliberate terror campaign designed to break the will of the Chinese people. In one incident, 2 Japanese officers, 2nd Lieutenant Toshiaki Mukai and 2nd Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Noda, held a competition to see who could be the first to kill 100 people with a sword. The contest was reported in Japanese newspapers as a heroic feat, with headlines celebrating their achievement. When they both exceeded 100 kills, they decided to extend the competition to 150. This was the mentality of the army approaching Nanjing. Killing was not just duty, it was sport. By early December, the Japanese forces had surrounded the city. Nanjing was the capital of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. It was home to over 1 million people, including government officials, soldiers, and civilians. As the Japanese closed in, panic spread. The Chinese government evacuated to Chongqing, deep in the interior. Most of the Chinese military leadership fled as well, leaving behind an estimated 90,000 poorly trained and demoralized troops to defend the city.
On December 12, 1937, the remaining Chinese commander, General Tang Shengshi, ordered his troops to retreat. But there was no organized evacuation plan. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms, trying to blend in with civilians. Many tried to flee across the Yangtze River, but Japanese artillery and machine guns cut them down. The river turned red with blood. Thousands drowned in the chaos. The next day, December 13th, Japanese troops entered Nanjing. What followed was not the orderly occupation of a conquered city. It was the unleashing of pure, systematic violence. The massacre had begun. Japanese soldiers immediately began rounding up Chinese soldiers who had surrendered or were hiding among civilians. According to international law, prisoners of war must be treated humanely, but the Japanese commanders had no intention of taking prisoners. They viewed surrendered soldiers as cowards and traitors who did not deserve to live. In the following days, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers, many still in uniform, were systematically executed. They were taken to the banks of the Yangtze River, tied together in groups, and machine-gunned. Their bodies were pushed into the river or left to rot in massive piles. In one of the largest mass executions, between December 15th and 17th, Japanese troops from the Yamada detachment led an estimated 17,000 to 20,000 Chinese prisoners to the riverbanks near Mufu Mountain and massacred them all. The killing was methodical. Soldiers used machine guns, rifles, swords, and bayonets. Those who tried to escape were hunted down and killed. The entire operation was carried out under direct orders from senior commanders, including Prince Asaka, a member of the Japanese imperial family who had been given command of the Shanghai Expeditionary Army. Recent research has confirmed that the mass killings were pre-planned and executed in a systematic manner in accordance with orders issued directly from the top of the military hierarchy. But the violence did not stop with soldiers. Japanese troops began searching homes, dragging out civilians, men, women, children, and the elderly. They were killed in the streets, in their homes, in alleyways, and in parks. The killing was indiscriminate and relentless. American missionary John McGee, who stayed in Nanjing during the massacre, wrote in a letter to his wife, "The Japanese soldiers slaughtered not only all the prisoners they could find, but also a large number of civilians of all ages. It was like hunting rabbits in the wild. Many civilians were indiscriminately killed by the Japanese soldiers on the streets." The scale of the slaughter was staggering. In just the first week, tens of thousands of people were killed. And this was only the beginning.
As the massacre continued, Japanese soldiers turned their violence toward the women of Nanjing. What followed was one of the most horrific campaigns of sexual violence in modern history. Rape became a systematic weapon of terror. According to the judgment of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which tried Japanese war criminals after the war, nearly 20,000 cases of rape occurred in Nanjing during the first month of occupation alone. Many historians believe the true number was far higher, possibly between 20,000 and 80,000 women and girls. No one was spared. Victims ranged from young girls as young as 6 years old to elderly women in their 70s and 80s. Pregnant women were raped and then killed. Women were gang raped in front of their families. Many were mutilated after the assault. Some were killed immediately. Others were taken to military brothels and held as sex slaves. Japanese soldiers operated in small groups, roaming the streets and breaking into homes. They dragged women out by force, raped them in public, and then often killed them to eliminate witnesses. In many cases, entire families were forced to watch as their daughters, wives, and mothers were violated. Those who tried to resist were killed on the spot. One survivor, Li Shuying, who was 19 years old at the time, was 7 months pregnant when Japanese soldiers broke into her home. They attempted to rape her, but she fought back. The soldiers stabbed her 37 times and left her for dead. Miraculously, she survived and later became one of the key witnesses in efforts to hold Japan accountable. Her testimony, along with that of other survivors, provided critical evidence of the systematic nature of the sexual violence. Foreign nationals living in Nanjing at the time documented the atrocities in diaries, letters, and photographs.
John Robb, a German businessman and Nazi party member, was so horrified by what he witnessed that he used his status to create the Nanjing safety zone, a designated area where civilians could seek refuge. Robb's diary, which he kept meticulously during the massacre, provides one of the most detailed accounts of the horrors. On December 17, 1937, he wrote, "Two Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear, they give the excuse that they saw two Chinese soldiers climb over the wall.
When I showed them my party badge, they returned the same way. In one of the houses in the narrow street behind my garden wall, a woman was raped and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we can take her to Kulo Hospital." Rabe and other members of the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, including American missionaries and doctors, worked tirelessly to protect as many people as possible. They estimate that the safety zone sheltered around 250,000 refugees during the worst of the massacre. But even within the safety zone, Japanese soldiers entered regularly to drag out women, kill men, and loot supplies. The rape and sexual violence were not isolated acts by rogue soldiers. They were part of a broader strategy of terror designed to humiliate and demoralize the Chinese population. Japanese military commanders were fully aware of what was happening and did nothing to stop it. In many cases, they encouraged it. The violence extended beyond rape to include widespread looting and arson. Japanese soldiers ransacked homes, shops, and public buildings, taking anything of value – money, jewelry, food, furniture, and clothing. What they could not carry, they destroyed. On December 21, 1937, John Rabe wrote in his diary, "There is no doubt that the Japanese are setting fire throughout the city, perhaps just to cover up traces of their looting. Last night, there were 6 fires in the city. One of the major fires occurred on Zhujiang Road." By the end of the massacre, approximately 1/3 of Nanking's buildings had been burned or destroyed. The bustling commercial districts of Taiping Road and Confucius Temple were reduced to ashes. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. The city that had once been a vibrant center of Chinese culture and politics was now a smoldering wasteland. Meanwhile, the killing continued. Japanese soldiers roamed the streets, executing anyone they suspected of being a soldier or resisting occupation. Bodies piled up in the streets, in ditches, and along the riverbanks. The stench of death filled the air. Survivors described the horror of living in a city where corpses were everywhere, where screams echoed day and night, and where there was no safety, no law, and no hope. The world outside Nanking remained largely unaware. China's government had fled. Foreign journalists had mostly evacuated. The few Westerners who stayed, like Rabe and McGee, sent desperate pleas for help, but the international community did little. Britain, France, and the United States were focused on their own concerns and unwilling to intervene in what they saw as a regional conflict. The massacre went on for 6 weeks, from mid-December 1937 to late January 1938. By the time it ended, the death toll had reached catastrophic levels. Conservative estimates place the number of dead at 200,000. Many historians and Chinese officials believe the true figure is closer to 300,000 or more. When the massacre finally ended in late January 1938, Nanjing was a city of ghosts. The streets were littered with bodies, the buildings were burned, and the survivors were traumatized beyond words. The Japanese military established a puppet government in the city and imposed strict control, attempting to restore order and rebuild the city under occupation. But the scars left by the massacre would never heal. In the months that followed, burial teams were organized to dispose of the tens of thousands of corpses that remained in the streets, in mass graves, and in the Yangtze River. 2 organizations, the Red Swastika Society and the Chungshin Tong, were tasked with the grim work of collecting and burying the dead. According to their records,
The Red Swastika Society buried 43,123 bodies, and the Chungshin Tong buried 112,267 bodies. These numbers do not include those whose bodies were never recovered, those who drowned in the Yangtze, or those burned beyond recognition. The true death toll may never be known. As the war continued, the Nanjing massacre was largely forgotten by the outside world. Japan controlled the narrative within its own borders, and the atrocities were never reported in Japanese newspapers or taught in schools. In China, the massacre became a rallying cry for resistance, but under Japanese occupation, survivors were forbidden from speaking about what had happened. It was not until the end of World War II that the truth began to emerge. In 1945, after Japan's surrender, the Allied powers established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trials, to prosecute Japanese war criminals. The tribunal operated from 1946 to 1948 and tried 28 high-ranking military and political leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Among those tried was General Iwani Matsui, who had commanded the Japanese forces that captured Nanjing. During the trial, extensive evidence was presented about the massacre, including testimony from survivors, diaries from foreign witnesses like John Rabe and John McGee, and photographs documenting the atrocities. In 1948, Matsui was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed on December 23, 1948. Another key figure, Prince Asaka, who had direct command authority during the massacre, was never prosecuted. As a member of the imperial family, he was granted immunity by General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, in order to preserve the Japanese monarchy and ensure a smooth occupation. This decision remains controversial to this day.
Many believe that justice was denied because political considerations took precedence over accountability. Despite the Tokyo trials, many Japanese perpetrators of the Nanjing massacre were never punished. Lower-ranking officers and soldiers returned to civilian life in Japan, and the massacre was gradually erased from public memory. In the decades that followed, Japan's approach to the massacre ranged from denial to minimization. Some right-wing politicians and historians claimed that the massacre never happened or that the death toll was greatly exaggerated. Others argued that the killings were justified acts of war. This denial deeply angered China and other Asian nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation. In China, the memory of the massacre remained alive. Survivors and their families kept the stories alive, and the Chinese government made the massacre a central part of its national narrative about the war. In 1985, the Memorial Hall of the Victims and Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders was officially opened in Nanjing. The museum is built on the site of one of the mass graves and contains exhibits, documents, photographs, and testimonies that tell the story of the massacre. Every year on December 13, a National Memorial Day is held in China to remember the victims. In recent decades, efforts have been made to bring the truth to light and ensure that the massacre is not forgotten. In the 1990s, Chinese-American journalist Iris Chang published The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II, a groundbreaking book that brought international attention to the massacre and criticized Japan's continued denial. The book became a bestseller and sparked renewed interest in the history of the massacre. In 1997, a group of Chinese survivors filed a lawsuit in Tokyo District Court demanding an official apology and compensation from the Japanese government. The case was eventually dismissed, but it forced Japan to confront its history in a public forum. In 2015, UNESCO inscribed documents related to the Nanjing Massacre in the Memory of the World Register, recognizing the historical significance of the atrocities and the importance of preserving the memory for future generations. Japan protested the decision and even threatened to withdraw funding from UNESCO, but the inscription stood.
Today, the Nanjing Massacre remains a deeply sensitive issue in China-Japan relations. While some Japanese leaders have expressed regret or offered apologies, others continue to downplay or deny the atrocities. This ongoing debate over history has fueled mistrust and anger, making reconciliation difficult.
The legacy of the Nanjing Massacre extends far beyond the 6 weeks of violence in 1937 and 1938. It is a stark reminder of what happens when military power is combined with hatred, dehumanization, and impunity. The massacre raises fundamental questions about human nature, the nature of war, and the responsibility of nations to confront their past. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Nanjing Massacre is that it was not the result of chaos or loss of control. It was systematic, organized, and carried out under the command of senior military officers. The soldiers who committed these atrocities were not monsters. They were ordinary men who had been trained to view the enemy as subhuman and to obey orders without question. This is the same dynamic that enabled the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and countless other mass atrocities throughout history. When people are taught to dehumanize others, when violence is normalized, and when there is no accountability, the worst of human nature emerges. The Nanjing Massacre also highlights the failure of the international community to intervene. Despite reports from foreign witnesses and pleas for help, the world did nothing to stop the massacre. The League of Nations, which was supposed to maintain peace and prevent atrocities, was powerless. Western nations, focused on their own interests, chose to look the other way. This pattern of inaction has repeated itself time and again in the decades since. From Cambodia to Bosnia to Rwanda to Darfur, the world has repeatedly failed to prevent mass atrocities, even when the warning signs were clear. The Nanjing Massacre is a reminder that silence and inaction in the face of evil are a form of complicity. This denial is deeply hurtful to survivors and their families, and it prevents genuine reconciliation between China and Japan. One of the most important lessons of the Nanjing Massacre is the importance of historical truth. When nations refuse to acknowledge their past crimes, they create a cycle of resentment and mistrust that can last for generations. Germany's approach to the Holocaust offers a contrasting example. By acknowledging its crimes, educating its citizens, and taking responsibility for the past, Germany has been able to rebuild its relationships with its neighbors and move forward. Japan's continued reluctance to fully confront the Nanjing Massacre and other wartime atrocities has hindered its ability to do the same. For survivors of the Nanjing Massacre, the fight for recognition and justice has been a lifelong struggle. Many have spent decades speaking out, giving testimony, and demanding that the truth be told. Their courage and determination have ensured that the massacre is not forgotten. As the last survivors pass away, it becomes even more important to preserve their stories and ensure that future generations understand what happened. The Memorial Hall in Nanjing plays a critical role in this effort. It is not just a museum. It is a place of mourning, remembrance, and education. Visitors can see the mass graves, read survivor testimonies, and view photographs and documents that provide a detailed account of the massacre. The museum also serves as a reminder that history is not just about the past, it is about the present and the future. Today, as we face new challenges, rising nationalism, ethnic hatred, and authoritarian governments, the lessons of the Nanjing Massacre are more relevant than ever. The massacre teaches us that violence and hatred do not emerge overnight. They are the result of years of propaganda, dehumanization, and the normalization of cruelty. They are the result of ordinary people choosing to follow orders rather than question them. And they are the result of the world choosing to look away rather than intervene. As a society, we have a responsibility to remember the victims of the Nanjing massacre, to honor their suffering, and to learn from their experience. We must teach this history honestly and fully, without minimization or denial. We must hold those who commit atrocities accountable, even if it is politically inconvenient. And we must speak out against injustice, even when it is difficult or dangerous. The victims of Nanjing did not die in vain if their suffering teaches us the importance of human dignity, the dangers of hatred, and the necessity of justice. The history of the Nanjing massacre is not just Chinese history or Japanese history. It is human history, and it is a history that must never be forgotten.